Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I was 26 years old that October when everything changed. The date was October 15th, 2024, and I'd just moved into the rental house on Maple Ridge Road about 15 miles outside of town. The isolation felt perfect after the chaos of city life. Nothing but pine trees, rolling hills, and the occasional wildlife passing through my yard. That Tuesday afternoon started like any other. I'd called in sick to work, nursing what I thought was just a head cold, and spent most of the day wrapped in blankets on my secondhand couch. The television droned on with daytime programming I wasn't really watching, just background noise to fill the oppressive quiet of the countryside. Around 3 o'clock, movement outside caught my peripheral vision. Through the sliding glass door that led to my back deck, I spotted them. 5 deer picking their way across the yellowing grass of my yard. White-tailed deer were common in this area, so the sight should have been unremarkable. I'd seen dozens since moving here 2 weeks ago, but something made me reach for the remote and mute the television. The silence that followed felt different than the usual rural quiet. It pressed against my eardrums like cotton, thick and unnatural. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, no distant traffic hum. Just the muffled sound of my own breathing fogging up the glass as I leaned closer to watch. The deer moved with their typical cautious grace, heads bobbing up to scan for threats before lowering to crop the grass. 3 does and 2 young bucks, all healthy-looking with thick autumn coats. Normal in every way except... I squinted, pressing my face against the cool glass. Something about the way the largest doe was walking didn't look right. Her left rear leg seemed to bend at an odd angle with each step, not quite following the natural movement I'd expect. At first I thought maybe she'd been injured, perhaps struck by a car or caught in a fence. But as I watched more closely, the anomaly became harder to dismiss. The joint appeared to bend backward, then forward, then sideways in a slow, deliberate motion that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't the jerky, protective movement of an injured animal. It was fluid, controlled, almost experimental. I rubbed my eyes, certain the fever was making me see things. When I looked again, the doe had moved closer to the house, and now I could see her movement pattern more clearly. The leg wasn't just bending wrong. It was bending in directions that violated basic anatomy. The knee joint seemed to rotate completely around with each step, as if the bones and ligaments had become liquid. My mouth went dry. I blinked hard several times, waiting for the hallucination to correct itself. But the doe continued her impossible gait, and now I noticed the other deer were exhibiting similar distortions. The smaller buck's front legs appeared to elongate as he walked, stretching like taffy being pulled. His neck, too, seemed to extend and contract rhythmically. The fever, I told myself. Had to be the fever. I pressed my hand to my forehead. It felt warm, but not burning. The thermometer I'd used that morning had read only 99.8 degrees, hardly enough to cause vivid hallucinations. But what I was seeing couldn't be real. The deer continued grazing, seemingly unaware that their bodies were defying the laws of physics. The largest doe lifted her head and looked directly at me through the glass door. Her eyes appeared larger than they should be, taking up too much of her face, and they held an intelligence that made the hair on my arms stand up. She stared at me for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then she opened her mouth and made a sound. It wasn't the snort or grunt I'd expect from a deer. It was a low, resonant moan that seemed to come from deep in her chest, a sound that vibrated through the glass and into my bones. The other deer didn't react to it at all, just continued their strange, fluid grazing. I stumbled backward from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound had been wrong on a fundamental level, like hearing a familiar song played in a minor key. It carried a note of something almost human, but distorted beyond recognition. When I looked outside again, all 5 deer had stopped eating and were staring at the house. Their necks had stretched impossibly long, their heads now hovering 3 feet above their bodies like balloons on strings. Yet they maintained perfect balance, their malformed legs supporting these grotesque proportions without any apparent strain. I wanted to run, to get as far from the window as possible, but I found myself frozen in place. The deer began to move again, but their locomotion had changed completely. They flowed across the grass like liquid, their limbs undulating in waves rather than taking discrete steps. Their bodies seemed to elongate and contract like accordions, maintaining their basic deer-like shape while constantly shifting in size and proportion. As they moved toward the tree line at the edge of my property, their forms became even more distorted. The does grew taller and thinner, their legs extending until they resembled grotesque stilts. The bucks became shorter and wider, their bodies compressing like sponges being squeezed. By the time they reached the shadows beneath the pine trees, they barely looked like deer at all. They were flowing, shifting silhouettes that hurt to look at directly. My brain kept trying to categorize what I was seeing, to force it into familiar patterns, but the images slipped away like water through fingers. The last one to disappear, the doe who had stared at me, paused at the forest's edge and turned back. Even from 50 yards away, I could feel the weight of her gaze. She opened her mouth again, and this time the sound that emerged was unmistakably human. "Help us!" The words carried clearly across the yard, spoken in a woman's voice filled with anguish and desperation. Then she melted into the shadows between the trees, leaving me alone with the terrible silence. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those impossible shapes flowing across my yard like living nightmares. The woman's voice, if it had been a woman's voice, echoed in my head until I began to question whether I'd heard anything at all. By morning, I'd convinced myself it had all been a fever dream. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me through college and into a decent job as a data analyst, insisted that deer don't bend like rubber, and they certainly don't speak English. I'd been sick, probably dehydrated, and my brain had conjured the entire episode. I made coffee and toast, forcing myself to go through normal morning routines. The sunlight streaming through the kitchen window looked ordinary enough, revealing a perfectly normal yard with perfectly normal grass and perfectly normal pine trees. No signs of the surreal parade I thought I'd witnessed. But when I opened the sliding door to step onto the deck with my coffee, I found the hoof prints. They were pressed deep into the soft earth of my flower bed, much deeper than they should have been for animals that couldn't have weighed more than 150 pounds each. But it was the shape of the prints that made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped my mug. They were elongated, stretched out like someone had taken normal deer tracks and pulled them through wet clay. Some were nearly a foot long, others compressed into tight circles no bigger than quarters. A few appeared to overlap in impossible ways, as if the same hoof had struck the ground multiple times in the exact same spot without lifting. I knelt down and touched one of the larger prints. The earth was packed hard as concrete, compressed with a force that should have required hydraulic pressure. When I tried to push my finger into the dirt beside it, I barely made an indentation. Standing up too quickly made me dizzy. I gripped the deck railing and tried to process what I was seeing. Either these tracks were evidence that last night had been real, or I was having a complete psychological breakdown. Neither option offered much comfort. I spent the rest of the morning on my laptop, searching for explanations. Deer leg deformities brought up articles about chronic wasting disease and various genetic conditions. Unusual animal behavior led me down rabbit holes about rabies, parasites, and environmental toxins. Nothing came close to describing what I'd witnessed. Around noon, I tried calling the state wildlife department. The woman who answered listened patiently as I described some unusual deer behavior in my area, But when I started to explain the specifics, her responses became increasingly skeptical. She suggested I might have seen elk or even horses in the distance, and that lighting conditions could create optical illusions. I hung up without mentioning the voice or the impossible hoof prints. The afternoon stretched endlessly. I found myself checking the windows every few minutes, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The yard remained empty, but the silence felt oppressive. Even the normal sounds of rural life, distant tractors, barking dogs, the occasional car on the main road, seemed muffled and far away. Around 4 o'clock, my neighbor pulled into his driveway. Jerome was a retired farmer in his 70s who'd lived on the adjacent property for 40 years. He'd been friendly when I moved in, offering to help with yard work and sharing vegetables from his garden. If anyone would know about unusual animal activity in the area, it would be him. I walked over and found him unloading groceries from his pickup truck. He smiled when he saw me approaching, but the expression faltered when he got a good look at my face. "You feeling all right, son? You look like you haven't slept in a week." "I'm fine," I lied. "Just wondering if you've noticed anything strange with the local wildlife lately. Deer acting oddly, maybe?" Jerome set down a bag of groceries and studied me with sharp blue eyes. "What kind of odd behavior?" I struggled to find words that wouldn't make me sound insane. "Movement patterns that seem unusual? Maybe some kind of disease affecting their coordination?" He was quiet for a long moment, his expression growing serious. "You saw them, didn't you?" The simple question hit me like a physical blow. "Saw what?" "The bent ones." He glanced toward my property, then back at me. "They showed up about 3 weeks ago. Started with just one, a young buck with legs that moved wrong. Thought he'd been hit by a car, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "But what?" "But injured animals don't usually get worse over time, and they don't travel in groups." Jerome picked up his groceries and started toward his house. "You should probably stay inside after dark for a while." "Jerome, wait." I followed him up his porch steps. "What exactly have you seen?" He paused with his hand on the door handle. "Things I don't like to talk about. Things that make me sound crazy." He looked at me again, and I saw fear in his weathered features. "But if you've seen them too, maybe I'm not as crazy as I thought." "Have you reported this to anyone?" Jerome let out a bitter laugh. "Sure did. Called the wildlife department, the county sheriff, even the agricultural extension office. Know what they told me? Same thing they probably told you. Lighting tricks and imagination. But you know what you saw. I know that I've been living in these hills for 7 decades, and I've never seen anything like what's been happening lately." He opened his door, then paused. "You want some advice? Get yourself a gun, and don't go outside alone after sunset. Whatever those things are, they're not natural." He went inside, leaving me standing on his porch with more questions than answers. At least I wasn't alone in this. Jerome had seen them too. But somehow that knowledge made everything worse instead of better. If 2 rational adults were witnessing the same impossible phenomena, then either we were both losing our minds or something genuinely terrifying was happening in these woods. I walked home as the sun began to set, and for the first time since moving to the country, I locked my doors. The next day brought no relief from the growing dread that had settled in my chest like a stone. I called in sick to work again, claiming my flu had worsened, but the truth was I couldn't concentrate on anything except the mystery of the bent ones. Jerome's warning echoed in my mind. They're not natural. I spent the morning diving deeper into online research, this time expanding my search beyond normal wildlife behavior. If conventional explanations weren't working, maybe I needed to look at unconventional possibilities. That's when I stumbled across a series of forum posts on a website dedicated to unexplained phenomena. The thread was titled, Anatomical Anomalies in Rural Pennsylvania, and it had been active for just over a month. My heart rate spiked as I read through the entries. User Chester County resident posted, "Saw 3 deer yesterday that moved like their bones were made of rubber, legs bending in impossible directions. Anyone else experiencing this?" Farm Life 2019 replied, "Yes, same thing here, about 20 miles north of Chester County. Thought I was losing my mind. They make sounds too, don't they? Sounds that aren't quite animal." Gunter Hunter responded, "My trail cameras caught some footage last week. Can't make sense of what I'm seeing. The deer appear normal in daylight photos, but the night vision videos show something else entirely." I scrolled through dozens of similar accounts, each one describing encounters remarkably similar to mine. The geographical pattern was disturbing. All the sightings were concentrated in a roughly 50-mile radius of rural southeastern Pennsylvania, with the earliest reports dating back about 6 weeks. But it was the final post in the thread that made my blood pressure spike. Naturalist Ned wrote, "For those brave enough to investigate further, there's a research facility about 15 miles south of the main cluster of sightings. Meridian Biological Research. They do work with genetic modification and environmental testing. Might be worth looking into their recent activities." Meridian Biological Research. I'd never heard of them, but a quick web search revealed a sparse corporate website listing environmental consulting and biotechnology services. Their address placed them less than 20 miles from my house. I grabbed my car keys. The drive to Meridian took me through increasingly remote countryside, past farms that looked abandoned and forests that seemed darker than they should in the middle of the day. The facility itself was smaller than I'd expected, just a cluster of prefabricated buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. A guard station stood empty at the entrance, but the gate was open. Warning signs covered the fence. Authorized personnel only. Biological hazard. No trespassing. I parked on the shoulder of the access road and studied the complex through binoculars I'd brought from my hiking gear. The place looked deserted. No vehicles in the parking lot, no lights in the windows, no signs of activity. But as I watched, movement caught my eye near the rear of the compound. Something large and dark emerged from behind the farthest building, moving with that same impossible fluidity I'd witnessed in my yard. Even from a quarter mile away, I could tell it wasn't quite a deer anymore. The proportions were wrong, stretched and compressed in ways that hurt to process visually. It moved across the open ground behind the buildings with a flowing gait that reminded me of oil spreading across water. Then another appeared, and another. Within minutes, I counted at least a dozen of the creatures moving around the facility like they owned the place. Some were clearly derived from deer, but others had proportions that suggested different origins, possibly dogs, possibly something larger. I lowered the binoculars with shaking hands. Whatever Meridian Biological Research had been doing, it had created something that was now spreading into the surrounding ecosystem. The bent ones weren't just sick animals. They were the result of human interference with nature. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop watching. Go home. You don't want to be here when they notice you." I spun around, scanning the empty road in both directions. No other cars, no visible observers. But someone was monitoring the facility, someone who knew I was there. Another text arrived. "Check your rearview mirror." I looked, and my heart nearly stopped. One of the creatures stood in the road about 100 yards behind my car. Even at that distance, I could see its neck extending upward like a periscope, its head turning in my direction. As I watched, its torso began to stretch vertically, growing taller and thinner until it resembled a grotesque telephone pole with legs. I gunned the engine and floored the accelerator, leaving rubber on the asphalt as I sped away from the facility. In my rearview mirror, I saw the creature collapse back to normal proportions and disappear into the roadside brush. The drive home passed in a blur of adrenaline and terror, Someone, or something, was orchestrating events around the research facility. The bent ones weren't just random mutants. They were being directed, controlled. And now they knew I'd been watching. That evening, I called Jerome and asked if I could come over. I needed to tell someone what I'd discovered, and he was the only person who might believe me. When I arrived at his house, he was sitting on his porch with a shotgun across his lap. "They've been circling my property all afternoon," he said without preamble. "Haven't seen them this active during daylight before." I told him about the research facility, the forum posts, and my encounter on the access road. Jerome listened without interruption, his weathered face growing grimmer with each detail. "Genetic modification," he said when I finished. "God almighty, what were they thinking?" The facility looked abandoned. Maybe they lost control of whatever they created. Jerome shook his head. "If someone texted you warnings, then somebody's still pulling the strings. Question is whether they're trying to contain this mess or make it worse." As if summoned by his words, both our phones chimed simultaneously with new messages from the same unknown number. "Stay inside tonight. All of tonight. Don't look outside no matter what you hear." I met Jerome's eyes and saw my own fear reflected there. Whatever was coming, it was going to be worse than anything we'd witnessed so far. I should have gone home and followed the anonymous warning, but Jerome insisted I stay at his place. "Two pairs of eyes are better than one," he said, "and two guns are better than one gun." He'd armed me with an old hunting rifle from his collection, though I had serious doubts about whether conventional weapons would be effective against creatures that could reshape their own anatomy. We settled in for what promised to be the longest night of our lives. Jerome's house was built like a fortress, thick stone walls, small windows, and heavy wooden doors that he'd reinforced with steel bars. He'd been preparing for this confrontation longer than I'd realized. "How long have you known about the research facility?" I asked, as we positioned ourselves in his living room with views of both my property and his. "Found it 2 weeks ago," Jerome replied, checking his shotgun for the 10th time. "Drove out there after the 3rd time I saw those things in my pasture. Place was already abandoned by then, but the damage was done. Outside, the sun had set completely, leaving us in the kind of darkness that only exists in rural areas far from city lights. The silence was absolute. No insects, no night birds, no small animals rustling through the undergrowth. Even the ever-present whisper of wind through the pine trees had stopped. "They're coming," Jerome whispered. At first I didn't see anything. Then movement caught my eye near the tree line behind my house. Shapes emerged from the shadows between the pines, but they weren't moving like any animal I'd ever seen. They flowed across the open ground like spilled mercury, their forms constantly shifting and reforming. "How many?" I asked, though my voice came out as barely a croak. Jerome was counting under his breath. 12. 15. Still coming." He paused. 23 total. More than I've ever seen together. The creatures spread out across both our properties in what appeared to be a coordinated formation. Some remained roughly deer-shaped, while others had taken on proportions that defied classification. One near my deck had grown to the size of a small horse, its legs stretched impossibly thin to support its enlarged torso. Another had compressed itself into something resembling a giant slug with antlers. But it was their behavior that truly chilled me. They weren't grazing or exhibiting any typical animal patterns. Instead, they seemed to be searching. Their elongated necks swayed back and forth like periscopes as they methodically examined every inch of our properties. "They're looking for us," I realized. "Hunting us," Jerome corrected grimly. One of the creatures approached Jerome's house, its head extending upward until it reached the level of our second-story windows. Through the glass I could see its eyes, no longer the simple dark eyes of a deer, but complex organs with multiple pupils that moved independently of each other. It studied the window with an intelligence that was undeniably human. Then it spoke. "We know you're in there." The voice was clearer than the previous day, a perfect female contralto that might have belonged to a news anchor or telephone operator. "We need to talk to you about what you've seen." Jerome and I exchanged glances. Neither of us moved or made a sound. "We're not going to hurt you," the creature continued. "We just want to explain what's happening, to help you understand." Other creatures had begun to gather around Jerome's house, their forms shifting and flowing as they took positions that would block all the exits. Some had grown additional limbs, arms that emerged from their torsos like tree branches, ending in hands with too many fingers. Others had developed multiple heads that whispered to each other in languages I couldn't identify. "Please," the creature at the window said. "We used to be like you. We remember what it was like to be human." The words hit me like a physical blow. These weren't mutated deer. They were mutated people. The research facility hadn't been experimenting on animals. They'd been experimenting on human subjects. The implications made my stomach turn. "What did they do to you?" I called out before Jerome could stop me. The creature's multiple eyes focused on the sound of my voice. "They promised us enhancement, adaptation, evolution beyond the limitations of fixed anatomy." Its voice carried infinite sadness. "They gave us the ability to change our bodies at will, but they couldn't control the process. We kept changing, and we can't stop." "How many of you are there?" 47 in our group, more scattered throughout the region. Some have changed so much they can no longer communicate." The creature's form shuddered, its neck contracting and expanding like a bellows. "We're trying to find the researchers who did this to us, to make them reverse the process." "They're gone," Jerome said, finally speaking up. "The facility's been abandoned." "No." This came from multiple creatures simultaneously, their voices creating an eerie harmony. "They're still here, watching, waiting to see how far the changes will progress." One of the smaller creatures approached the front door, its body compressing until it could fit through the gap beneath the frame. I watched in horror as it flowed under the door like liquid, then reformed on Jerome's entryway. Up close, I could see that its hide was translucent, revealing organs that pulsed and shifted like living machinery. "They're inside the mountain," it said, extending what might have been a finger to point south toward the distant hills. "Deep underground, still running their experiments." "What do you want from us?" Jerome demanded, keeping his shotgun trained on the creature. "Help us find them. Help us get our lives back." The creature's voice was that of a young man, probably in his 20s. "We can't do this alone. We need normal humans who can go places we can't. Ask questions we can't ask." "And if we refuse?" The creature that had been speaking through the window pressed closer to the glass. "Then you'll become like us. The genetic modifications are airborne now. Everyone in a 50-mile radius has been exposed. The only question is how long before the changes begin." My rifle clattered to the floor as the full horror of the situation hit me. We weren't just witnessing an isolated incident. We were part of an ongoing experiment. The entire region had been contaminated, and the transformations were spreading. "How long do we have?" I asked. "Based on our experiences, the first changes begin within 72 hours of exposure," the creature replied. "You've both been exposed for at least a week. The process will begin soon." Jerome lowered his shotgun, his face pale with defeat. "God help us all." "God can't help us now," the creature said sadly. "But maybe you can help us stop this before it spreads any further." Outside, the other creatures had begun to flow back toward the tree line, their reconnaissance apparently complete. Only the one inside remained, its translucent form pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that hadn't been there moments before. "Think about what we've told you," it said. We'll return tomorrow night for your answer. And remember, whether you help us or not, you're already part of this now." The creature compressed itself and flowed back under the door, leaving Jerome and me alone with the terrible knowledge that our transformation had already begun. I didn't return to my own house that night. Jerome and I sat in his kitchen until dawn, drinking coffee and trying to process what we'd learned. Every small sensation, a muscle twitch, a joint ache, an unusual hunger pang, sent waves of paranoia through both of us. Were these the first signs of change, or just normal bodily functions amplified by fear? "We need to get out of here," I said as the first gray light filtered through the windows. "Drive somewhere far away, maybe find a doctor who can help us." Jerome shook his head. 72 hours, they said. If we've been exposed for a week, running won't change anything. And if this thing is airborne, we might just spread it to wherever we go. He was right. But the thought of staying here, waiting for our bodies to betray us, felt like surrender. I found myself examining my hands obsessively, looking for any sign that my fingers were beginning to elongate or my joints were becoming too flexible. Around 8 in the morning, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my supervisor's number. "Where the hell are you?" Kevin's voice was sharp with irritation. "You've missed 3 days this week, and the Henderson report was due yesterday." For a moment, I couldn't remember what the Henderson report was, or why it had ever seemed important. The normal world of deadlines and meetings felt like something from another lifetime. "I'm sick," I managed. "Some kind of virus. I think I need to take extended leave." "Extended leave? You've been here 8 months. You don't have enough vacation time built up for extended leave." Then I quit. The words came out before I'd consciously decided to say them, but they felt right. What was the point of pretending my old life still mattered when I might not be human much longer? I hung up and turned off my phone. Jerome nodded approvingly. "Good," he said. "We're going to need all our focus for what's coming." We spent the morning researching the underground facility the creatures had mentioned. Topographical maps showed an extensive cave system running through the mountains south of our location, with several old mining tunnels that had been abandoned decades ago. If the researchers had established a hidden laboratory, those caves would be the logical location. But first, we needed to understand exactly what we were dealing with. I convinced Jerome to drive back to the Meridian facility with me, this time prepared for a closer investigation. The research complex looked even more desolate in daylight. Windows stared blindly from the prefabricated buildings, and weeds had already begun to grow through cracks in the parking lot asphalt. But the chain-link fence hummed with electricity, suggesting the place wasn't as abandoned as it appeared. We parked a safe distance away and approached on foot, keeping to the tree line. Jerome had brought bolt cutters from his farm, and we found a section of fence hidden from the main buildings where we could create an opening. "Motion sensors," Jerome whispered, pointing to small devices mounted on poles throughout the compound. "They know we're here." But no security appeared to challenge us. We moved quickly between buildings, trying to find an unlocked entrance. Most of the doors required electronic key cards, but a service entrance near the rear had been left propped open with a brick. The interior of the building was a maze of sterile corridors and empty laboratories. Equipment had been removed, but not all of it. Centrifuges, incubators, and computer workstations remained scattered throughout the facility. More importantly, we found documentation. In a file cabinet that had been overlooked during the evacuation, I discovered a stack of research reports dated from 6 months ago. The project was called Adaptive Morphology Initiative, and the goal was exactly what the creatures had described: developing humans who could modify their physical form at will. "Listen to this," I said, reading from one of the reports. "Phase 3 trials will involve 30 subjects exposed to concentrated AMI serum in a controlled environment. Subjects will be monitored for morphological changes over a 6-week period. Jerome looked over my shoulder at the document. 30 subjects. The creature said there were 47 in their group. Maybe some didn't survive the process, I suggested, though the thought made me sick. I kept reading. The reports detailed a progression of increasingly dramatic physical changes in the test subjects. Early modifications were minor: enhanced flexibility, accelerated healing, improved sensory perception. But as the serum accumulated in their systems, the changes became more extreme and less controllable. Subject 15 demonstrates ability to extend limb length by up to 300%, I read aloud. However, subject reports significant pain and difficulty returning to baseline proportions. Recommend reducing serum concentration for future trials. The final report in the file was dated 8 weeks ago, just before the first sightings of bent ones in the area. It described a catastrophic failure of the containment protocols. Multiple subjects have breached security barriers, the report stated. Morphological adaptations now include partial liquefaction of bone structure, allowing passage through openings as small as 4 inches in diameter. Facility evacuation is recommended until enhanced containment measures can be implemented. They lost control of their own test subjects, Jerome said grimly, and instead of cleaning up the mess, they just ran. But the most disturbing part was yet to come. The final page of the report contained a list of secondary exposure protocols, procedures for monitoring individuals who had come into contact with the escaped subjects. Environmental dispersion of AMI compounds through exhaled vapors, I read. All residents within a 50-mile radius should be considered potentially exposed. Recommend establishing covert observation posts to document progression of secondary infections. Jerome and I stared at each other as the implications sank in. We weren't just accidentally exposed, we were part of a deliberate study. The researchers hadn't abandoned the project. They'd simply moved it to a larger laboratory, the entire surrounding region. A sound from somewhere deeper in the building made us both freeze. Footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, slow and deliberate. Someone else was in the facility. We grabbed the files and moved toward the exit, but the footsteps were getting closer. Jerome pulled out his handgun. He'd insisted on bringing it despite my protests about the dangers of firearms in a confined space. "This way," he whispered, leading me down a side corridor toward what looked like an emergency exit. But as we rounded the corner, we came face to face with our pursuer. It was a woman in a white lab coat, maybe 40 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked completely normal, except for her eyes, which held the same multi-pupilled complexity I'd seen in the creatures outside Jerome's house. "Dr. Amanda Price," she said, extending a hand that had too many joints in the fingers. "I've been hoping to meet you two. You're exactly the kind of subjects we need for the next phase of our research." Dr. Price's smile revealed teeth that were too sharp and too numerous, filling her mouth like rows of needles. Despite her grotesque modifications, she moved with the confident authority of someone accustomed to being in control. "Please don't run," she said as Jerome raised his gun. "I'm not here to hurt you. Quite the opposite, actually. I'm here to offer you a choice." "The same choice you offered the others?" I demanded, clutching the stolen files against my chest. "The others volunteered," Dr. Price replied smoothly. "They were terminally ill patients who chose experimental treatment over certain death. The fact that their transformations exceeded our projections was unexpected." Jerome kept his weapon trained on her. "What kind of choice are you talking about?" "You've both been exposed to AMI compounds for 9 days now. The changes will begin within the next 24 hours, whether you cooperate with us or not." She gestured toward the files I was holding. "I see you've done your homework. You understand what's coming." "We understand that you're conducting illegal human experiments," I said. Dr. Price laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Illegal according to whose laws? The FDA? The Geneva Convention? Those regulations were written for a world where human biology was fixed and unchangeable. We're pioneering a new era of human evolution. You're creating monsters. I'm creating the next phase of human development. Her expression grew serious. Climate change, resource depletion, overpopulation. Traditional human anatomy is inadequate for the challenges our species will face in the coming decades. We need bodies that can adapt, that can survive in environments where fixed-form humans would perish. Jerome's gun hand was starting to shake. And you decided to test this theory on unwilling subjects. The volunteers knew the risks, Dr. Price insisted. And now we're offering you the same opportunity they had. Join our research program voluntarily, and we can guide your transformation. Let us help you adapt gradually with minimal discomfort. And if we refuse, then you'll change on your own, without any medical support or guidance. The process will be painful, unpredictable, and quite possibly fatal. She stepped closer, seemingly unconcerned about Jerome's weapon. I've seen what uncontrolled transformation looks like. It's not pleasant. I thought about the creatures we'd encountered, their obvious pain and confusion. What happened to your original volunteers? The ones from the facility? They're adapting beautifully, Dr. Price said. Learning to control their new abilities, exploring the boundaries of what human anatomy can become. They're the first generation of truly post-human beings. They told us they want to be changed back. Dr. Price's smile faltered for the first time. Temporary psychological adjustment issues. It's understandable that they would experience some regret during the transition period. But given time, they'll come to appreciate what they've become. Jerome finally spoke up. Where are you conducting these experiments now? I think you already know the answer to that question. Dr. Price gestured toward the south, in the direction of the mountains. We have a much better facility now. More space, better security, advanced equipment. Everything we need to perfect the process. How many more test subjects are you planning to collect? As many as it takes to ensure human survival, she replied without hesitation. This region represents the largest field trial of AMI compounds in human history. We have nearly 3,000 potential subjects to study over the coming months. The number hit me like a physical blow. 3,000 people, all unknowingly exposed to an experimental serum that would fundamentally alter their biology. Children, elderly people, entire families, all of them marked for transformation, whether they consented or not. You're insane, I whispered. I'm visionary, Dr. Price corrected. And you have 15 minutes to decide whether you want to be part of the future of human evolution or whether you'd prefer to face that future alone. She turned and walked away, her movements displaying the same fluid grace we'd observed in the other transformed subjects. Her legs bent at impossible angles with each step, allowing her to navigate the corridor with an efficiency that no normal human could match. Jerome lowered his gun with shaking hands. What do we do? I looked down at the files I was still clutching. The research reports contained detailed information about the underground facility, including maps of the tunnel systems and security protocols. If we could reach the right authorities, the FBI, the CDC, maybe even the military, we might be able to stop this madness before it spread beyond the current test area. We get this information to people who can shut them down, I said. And if we start changing before help arrives? I didn't have an answer for that question. The transformation timeline suggested we had less than 24 hours before our own modifications began. Even if we could reach outside authorities immediately, there was no guarantee they would believe us or act quickly enough to matter. But as we made our way back to Jerome's truck, I noticed something that gave me hope. My hands, which I'd been obsessively monitoring for signs of change, looked exactly the same as they had that morning. No elongated fingers, no additional joints, no unusual flexibility. Maybe the 72-hour timeline was just a psychological weapon, designed to make potential subjects surrender before their transformation actually began. maybe we still had time to fight back. We drove away from the facility in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. But as we reached the main road, I made a decision that would determine the course of everything that followed. "We're going to that underground lab," I announced. Jerome nearly drove off the road. "Are you out of your mind? That place will be crawling with security, not to mention whatever other experiments they're running down there." "It's the only way to get proof that outside authorities will believe," I explained. "Photos, video footage, maybe even physical evidence of what they're doing. Without that, we're just two guys with a crazy story about shape-shifting deer. And if we get caught? Then we become permanent test subjects instead of temporary ones," I admitted. "But if we don't try, 3,000 people are going to suffer the same fate as those volunteers." Jerome was quiet for several miles, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Finally, he nodded. "When do we go?" "Tonight," I said, "before our own changes begin, and before Dr. Price realizes we're not planning to cooperate." As we pulled into Jerome's driveway, I felt a strange tingling sensation in my fingertips. It was probably just nerves, I told myself. Just the anxiety of planning what might be a suicide mission. But deep down, I knew our time as normal humans was running out. We spent the afternoon preparing for what we both knew might be our final mission as unchanged humans. Jerome had an impressive collection of survival gear accumulated from decades of hunting and farming. Night vision goggles, rope climbing equipment, waterproof cameras, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. I focused on studying the facility maps we'd stolen, memorizing the tunnel layouts, and identifying the most likely locations for a hidden laboratory. The cave system was extensive, with multiple levels connected by both natural passages and man-made tunnels from the old mining operations. "Main access point is here," I said, pointing to a marked entrance about 3 miles into the mountains. "But there are at least 4 other ways in, including an old mine shaft that might not be monitored." Jerome looked up from cleaning his rifle. "How do we know they haven't sealed the other entrances?" "We don't. But if Dr. Price is running a major research operation down there, she'll need multiple escape routes in case of emergency. Basic facility security protocols." As the sun began to set, I noticed the tingling in my hands had spread to my forearms. When I flexed my fingers, the joints felt looser than they should, as if the cartilage was beginning to soften. Jerome was experiencing similar symptoms. He kept rolling his shoulders and stretching his neck, trying to relieve what he described as a deep ache in his bones. "It's starting," he said grimly as we loaded gear into his pickup truck. "Then we better hurry." The drive to the mountains took us through increasingly remote terrain. We passed several abandoned farmhouses and empty fields that should have been bustling with autumn harvest activity. The AMI contamination had apparently affected more than just the immediate area around our homes. We parked at the end of a logging road about a mile from the old mine shaft entrance. The hike through the forest was treacherous in the dark, even with night vision equipment. Ancient trees blocked out most of the moonlight, and the undergrowth was thick with thorns and fallen branches. But the worst part was the silence. The woods should have been alive with night sounds. Owls calling, small animals rustling through the leaves, insects chirping in the darkness. Instead, we moved through a dead zone where nothing stirred except the wind. "They're watching us," Jerome whispered as we approached the mine entrance. I didn't see anything, but I felt it too. The weight of unseen eyes tracking our progress. The transformed subjects Dr. Price had created were somewhere in these woods, probably reporting our every move to their handlers underground. The mine shaft entrance was partially concealed by a steel grate that had been installed decades ago to keep out trespassers. But someone had recently cut through the metal bars, leaving an opening just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "Recent modification," Jerome observed, running his fingers along the clean cuts in the steel. "They're definitely using this entrance." We activated our recording equipment and began the descent into the mountain. The tunnel sloped downward at a steep angle, supported by rotting timber beams that creaked ominously under the weight of tons of rock above our heads. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, creating puddles that reflected our flashlight beams like mirrors. After 20 minutes of careful progress, we reached a junction where the old mining tunnel intersected with what was clearly a modern excavation. Smooth concrete walls replaced the rough-hewn stone, and fluorescent lighting fixtures had been installed along the ceiling. "This way," I whispered, following the newer tunnel toward what the stolen maps indicated was the main laboratory complex. The passage led us deeper underground, past heavily reinforced doors marked with biohazard symbols and warnings in multiple languages. Through reinforced windows, we caught glimpses of empty holding cells and abandoned equipment. Whatever had been happening in these rooms, it had been moved to a different location. Then we heard the voices. Multiple people were talking somewhere ahead of us, their words echoing through the tunnel system in a way that made it impossible to determine exact numbers or locations. We moved more cautiously, using every shadow and alcove to remain hidden as we approached the source of the sound. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber that had been carved from the living rock. The space was easily the size of an aircraft hangar, with multiple levels connected by metal catwalks and spiral staircases. High-tech equipment filled every available surface. Computers, medical monitors, tanks containing unidentifiable specimens, and machines whose purpose I couldn't even guess. But it was the occupants of the chamber that made my blood freeze. Dr. Price stood at the center of the facility, but she was no longer even remotely human. Her body had elongated to nearly 8 feet in height, with arms that stretched like rubber bands as she operated multiple computer terminals simultaneously. Her head had flattened and widened, allowing room for dozens of eyes that moved independently to monitor different sections of the laboratory. Around her worked at least 20 other figures that might once have been human. Some had developed additional limbs that sprouted from their torsos like tree branches. Others had modified their sensory organs, enlarged ears, extended tongues, clusters of eyes growing from their necks and shoulders. All of them moved with the same fluid efficiency we'd observed in the creatures outside our homes. "Subject population is responding as projected," Dr. Price was saying, her voice now a harmonic blend of multiple tones. "Transformation rates exceed 90% within the target zone. We should begin Phase 4 within the next 72 hours. "What about the holdouts?" asked another researcher whose face had been replaced by a mass of sensory tentacles. "The two who refused cooperation?" Dr. Price's multitude of eyes focused on a bank of monitors showing surveillance footage from around our homes. "They're currently approaching sub-level 3. Their transformation has already begun. Note the increased joint flexibility and tissue elasticity. By the time they reach this chamber, they'll be ready for direct integration." I looked down at my hands and realized she was right. My fingers had elongated by at least 2 inches, and I could bend them in directions that should have been anatomically impossible. Jerome's neck had stretched to nearly twice its normal length, giving him an almost serpentine appearance. We were becoming like them whether we wanted to or not. "Phase 4 parameters?" the tentacled researcher continued. "Expansion beyond the current containment zone," Dr. Price replied. "Atmospheric dispersal of AMI compounds over a 500-mile radius. Complete transformation of the regional population within 6 months." The full scope of their plan hit me like a sledgehammer. They weren't just experimenting on isolated rural communities. They were planning to transform the entire eastern seaboard. Millions of people would be affected, all of them changed into something that barely qualified as human. Jerome and I exchanged glances, and I saw my own determination reflected in his elongated features. We had to stop this, even if it meant sacrificing ourselves in the process. I pulled out one of the explosive charges Jerome had brought from his farm, originally intended for clearing tree stumps, but powerful enough to collapse sections of the tunnel system. If we could destroy the laboratory and seal the facility, we might be able to contain the contamination and prevent the larger catastrophe. But as I prepared to set the timer, Dr. Price's multiple eyes suddenly focused directly on our hiding spot. "Welcome to the future," she said, her harmonious voice carrying clearly across the chamber. "Please come down and join us. Your transformation is nearly complete, and we have so much work to do together." Security doors slammed shut throughout the facility, cutting off all our escape routes. We were trapped in the heart of their operation, surrounded by creatures that had once been human, with our own humanity slipping away by the minute. The final phase of our transformation was about to begin, and we were powerless to stop it. The explosive charge felt impossibly heavy in my hands as Jerome and I emerged from our hiding place. Around us, the transformed researchers had stopped their work and turned to watch our descent into the main laboratory chamber. Their modifications were even more disturbing up close. Some had developed multiple heads that whispered to each other in languages that hurt to hear, while others had replaced their limbs entirely with tentacles or segmented appendages that resembled insect legs. Dr. Price approached us with movements that defied basic physics, her elongated form flowing down the metal staircase like liquid mercury. Up close, I could see that her multiple eyes weren't just clustered on her face. They emerged from every part of her body, creating a living surveillance system that could monitor all directions simultaneously. "You're handling the transition remarkably well," she said, her voice now a choir of harmonized tones. "Most subjects experience significant psychological distress during the initial morphological changes." I looked down at myself and nearly vomited. My arms had stretched to nearly twice their normal length, and my fingers had become so elongated they resembled the legs of a giant spider. Jerome's transformation was even more advanced. His torso had compressed while his limbs extended, giving him the proportions of a grotesque scarecrow. "What have you done to us?" Jerome's voice came out as a wet, bubbling sound. His vocal cords had apparently been modified along with everything else. "We've given you the gift of adaptation," Dr. Price replied. "Your bodies are no longer constrained by the arbitrary limitations of your original genetic code. You can become whatever the situation requires." "We never consented to this." "Consent is a luxury humanity can no longer afford," she said dismissively. "The climate catastrophes of the next century will require radical physiological adaptation. Fixed-form humans simply won't survive the coming environmental changes." I forced my transformed hands to steady the explosive device, though my elongated fingers made it difficult to operate the timer mechanism. "Even if you're right about climate change, this isn't the answer. You're destroying human civilization." "I'm evolving it," Dr. Price corrected. "The volunteers you met outside, they're the first generation of post-human beings. They can survive in environments that would kill normal humans. They can modify their bodies to process different types of food, breathe in altered atmospheric conditions, even adapt to radiation exposure." "They can't change back," Jerome pointed out. "You've taken away their choice." Dr. Price's numerous eyes blinked in sequence, creating a rippling effect across her transformed features. "Choice is an illusion anyway. Environmental pressures will force adaptation whether we guide the process or not. At least this way the transition can be controlled and optimized." I managed to activate the timer on the explosive charge, setting it for 30 seconds. If I could get it close to the main power coupling for the facility, the explosion might damage enough equipment to shut down their operation. But 30 seconds felt like an eternity when you're surrounded by creatures that can reshape their anatomy at will. "You're planning something," Dr. Price observed, her eyes focusing on the device in my hands. "Please don't do anything destructive. You'll only hurt yourselves and delay the inevitable." "Maybe," I said, clutching the charge against my chest. "But at least we'll stop you from spreading this contamination any further." "Contamination?" Dr. Price laughed, the sound echoing through the chamber like breaking bells. You still don't understand. The AMI compounds aren't a contamination, they're a vaccination. We're immunizing humanity against extinction. 20 seconds remaining on the timer. Around us, the other transformed researchers had begun to move closer, their modified bodies flowing and shifting as they prepared to restrain us. Some had developed additional arms that emerged from their backs like wings, while others had modified their leg structure to allow for rapid, spider-like movement across any surface. The atmospheric release scheduled for tomorrow will affect nearly 2 million people, Dr. Price continued. Within a year, we'll have expanded to cover the entire continental United States. Humanity will finally be free from the constraints of biological determinism. 15 seconds. Jerome had moved toward one of the computer terminals that controlled the facility's ventilation system. Even in his transformed state, his farming background gave him an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. If he could reverse the airflow, maybe we could prevent the scheduled atmospheric release. You can't stop evolution, Dr. Price said, extending one of her elongated arms toward the explosive device. It's already too late. The process is irreversible. 10 seconds. I dodged away from her grasping fingers, my own transformed body moving with surprising agility. The elongated limbs that had seemed so grotesque actually provided enhanced leverage and reach. Maybe Dr. Price was right about the adaptive advantages, but that didn't justify forcing the change on unwilling subjects. 5 seconds. Jerome, now! I shouted, diving toward the main power coupling. My friend slammed his modified fist into the ventilation control panel, sending sparks flying as circuitry overloaded throughout the facility. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main power systems failed, and I heard the distant rumble of machinery shutting down in the tunnels above us. 3 seconds. Dr. Price lunged toward me with impossible speed, her body stretching like taffy as she tried to reach the explosive device. But she was too late. The charge detonated against the power coupling in a brilliant flash of light and sound that shook the entire underground complex. Concrete dust rained from the ceiling as support structures cracked and buckled. The high-tech equipment that filled the chamber sparked and died as electrical systems overloaded throughout the facility. In the chaos that followed, Jerome and I fought our way toward one of the secondary tunnels, using our modified bodies' enhanced agility to navigate the collapsing laboratory. The other researchers were more concerned with salvaging their equipment than pursuing us, and Dr. Price had been caught in the blast radius of the explosion. We emerged from the mountain just as dawn was breaking over the valley. Behind us, smoke poured from multiple cave entrances as the underground facility burned. The atmospheric release systems had been destroyed, and with them, Dr. Price's plan to transform the larger population. But our victory came at a cost. Jerome and I were permanently changed, our bodies locked into forms that were no longer entirely human. We could never return to our old lives, never fully integrate into normal society. As we walked away from the mountain, other transformed subjects emerged from the woods around us. The original volunteers Dr. Price had experimented on, now free from her control and grateful for what we'd done. They formed a community of the changed, supporting each other as they learned to live with their new abilities. We established a settlement in the abandoned town nearest to the destroyed facility, creating a place where the transformed could exist without fear or persecution. Some of us learned to control our modifications, developing useful adaptations that helped the community thrive. Others remained locked in their altered forms, serving as living reminders of the price of unchecked scientific ambition. The outside world never learned the full truth about what happened in those mountains. Official reports blamed the incidents on a contained chemical spill that required permanent evacuation of the affected area. But those of us who survived know better. We are the living proof that humanity's future is not fixed, that our species can adapt and evolve in ways both wonderful and terrible. The question is whether we'll have the wisdom to guide that evolution responsibly, or whether we'll repeat Dr. Price's mistakes on an even larger scale. For now, we watch and wait, guardians of a secret that could either save humanity or destroy it. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind carries strange sounds from the deeper parts of the forest, I wonder if we truly stopped Dr. Price's work, or if we simply delayed it for another generation to discover. The bent ones still walk among us, forever changed but not forgotten. We are the bridge between what humanity was and what it might become. And God help us all if we fail to choose the right path forward. The decision to hike alone through the Black Rock Mountain wilderness seemed reasonable at the time. I'd been camping since childhood and had completed several solo treks before. This particular trail in northern Arizona was challenging but documented, remote enough to escape weekend crowds but established enough to follow. Or so I thought. The Navajo Nation lands bordering this wilderness have always been steeped in warnings. Tales passed down through generations about creatures that stalk unwary travelers. I'd heard these stories during previous trips through the Southwest, but attributed them to cultural folklore designed to keep people respectful of sacred lands. My plan was simple. 5 days of backcountry hiking, documenting plant species for my graduate research. I'd mapped the route carefully, packed appropriately, and left detailed plans with both the ranger station and my advisor. Standard protocol for solo wilderness excursions. Day 1 passed uneventfully. The autumn air carried that distinctive pine scent as I climbed steadily higher into the mountains. By late afternoon, I'd reached the first designated camping area, a small clearing near a seasonal stream that still held water despite the dry summer. Setting up camp became second nature years ago. Tent positioned on level ground away from widowmakers, food stored properly, basic campfire built in an existing ring. I recorded the day's observations in my journal before darkness fell completely. My headlamp cast weak light against the growing shadows as I finished my notations about the juniper variations I'd documented. That first night I slept deeply, the kind of exhausted sleep that follows physical exertion in mountain air. But sometime in the darkest hours, I woke suddenly, alert in a way that felt primal rather than conscious. Something had changed in the forest's ambient sounds. The normal chirps, rustles, and distant calls had ceased completely. Anyone who spent time in wilderness knows this silence isn't natural. It signals predator presence. I lay still, controlling my breathing, listening intently. Then I heard it. Footsteps circling my campsite, deliberate but not quite human. The cadence was off, the weight distribution strange, and they moved quickly, too quickly for someone navigating unfamiliar terrain in darkness. My first thought was bear, but bears don't move with that kind of purpose. Mountain lion? Possible, but something felt wrong about that too. I reached slowly for my bear spray, clutching it as the footsteps completed a circuit around my campsite before stopping directly behind my tent. I could sense a presence there, someone or something standing motionless, watching. The nylon barrier between us suddenly seemed absurdly inadequate. I controlled my breathing, fighting against instinctive panic. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes. Then came the sound that still haunts me. A low vocalization that approximated human speech, but wasn't quite right. Like someone learning to talk by mimicking without understanding. It sounded like my name, but distorted. By morning, I convinced myself I'd experienced some hybrid of dream and natural wilderness sounds. The rational mind works overtime to normalize the inexplicable. I noted unusual track patterns near my tent, human-shaped but with abnormal stride length and depth. Probably my own tracks, misinterpreted through lingering fear, I reasoned. I debated abandoning the trip but decided against it. My research was important, and I'd experienced wilderness anxiety before. I packed methodically and continued deeper into the mountains, following my planned route toward higher elevation. The autumn sun warmed my shoulders as I hiked, and daylight rationality began replacing nighttime fears. I couldn't know then that each step took me further from safety and deeper into territory where ancient warnings still carried weight. I couldn't know that what I'd experienced was merely an introduction, a first encounter with something that had already begun hunting me. By mid-afternoon on the second day, I'd reached an elevation where ponderosa pines gave way to aspen groves. The white trunks created natural columns against azure sky, leaves trembling in the slight breeze. I'd made good progress despite setting out later than planned, covering nearly 8 miles of steadily climbing terrain. The trail had grown less defined, requiring occasional checks against my topographical map and GPS. Cell service had disappeared hours ago, expected and accounted for in my safety planning. I was approximately 14 miles from the nearest access road, deep in backcountry that few hikers ventured into, especially this late in the season. I stopped at a small clearing to document several unusual fungal formations when I noticed the first anomaly. Scratched into several aspen trunks were symbols, not the typical initials or hearts carved by hikers, but deliberate patterns that appeared intentional yet indecipherable. Some resembled crude stick figures with elongated limbs, others geometric shapes arranged in sequences. My first thought was that I'd stumbled upon indigenous markings, perhaps boundary indicators. I photographed several for later research, careful not to disturb them. As I continued hiking, the symbols appeared with increasing frequency, some appearing quite fresh compared to others faded with time. Around 4 p.m., I reached my planned campsite near a high alpine lake. The spot offered natural shelter with stunning views of surrounding ridgelines. I established camp methodically, noting increased wind as dark clouds gathered over western peaks. The weather report had mentioned possible thunderstorms, common in these mountains during transition seasons. While gathering firewood before sunset, I discovered something unsettling. A small arrangement of bones formed into a pattern similar to the symbols I'd seen carved in trees. The bones appeared to be from small animals, arranged with obvious human intent. Hunting remnants seemed unlikely given the deliberate positioning. More disturbing was how recent it appeared. No dust coverage, no weather deterioration. Someone had been here within days, perhaps hours. I reminded myself other hikers occasionally ventured here despite the remoteness. Perhaps geology students or environmental researchers. As darkness approached, the promised storm arrived with theatrical intensity. Lightning illuminated the landscape in frozen moments, thunder following with physical force. Rain became hail, then driving rain again. I retreated to my tent, grateful for its reliable waterproofing. That's when I heard what sounded like whispered conversations outside. At first, I attributed it to wind playing through nearby rock formations or water running through newly formed channels. But as I listened more intentionally, patterns emerged that suggested language. Not English or any language I recognized, but definitely communication. And it seemed to be coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The whispers continued intermittently throughout the storm, sometimes seeming just outside my tent, other times distant. Occasionally they mimicked natural sounds, water flowing, branches breaking, before returning to their pseudo-linguistic patterns. I checked my equipment multiple times, looking for some explanation, radio interference on my emergency beacon perhaps. Everything functioned normally. I even stepped outside briefly during a lull in the rain, scanning the area with my headlamp. Nothing visible, yet the whispers continued, now seeming to come from the forest edge. I retreated inside, telling myself exhaustion combined with storm acoustics was creating auditory pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find familiar patterns in random stimulus. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, studied. The night passed fitfully. I dozed between storm cells, waking frequently to that sense of observation. During one waking period, I glanced toward the tent door and found myself paralyzed momentarily by what appeared to be a silhouette standing there, a figure illuminated by distant lightning, observing me through the thin material. By morning, rational explanation reasserted itself. The storm had caused minor flooding near the lake, explaining unusual sounds. The silhouette must have been a tree branch casting shadows. The bone arrangement likely left by previous campers. Everything had logical explanations. Yet when I emerged from my tent to survey the area, I discovered footprints in the mud surrounding my campsite. Dozens of them, circling repeatedly, coming to my tent's entrance, then departing. Some appeared human, others disturbingly not. And scattered among the tracks were fresh bone arrangements identical to what I'd found the previous evening. I stood motionless, processing implications. Someone, or multiple people, had surrounded my tent during the night while I dozed fitfully inside, watching, listening, leaving deliberate signs of their presence. And I was still 2 days from the nearest trailhead. The morning brought clearer weather but clouded judgment. I debated my options while breaking camp with mechanical efficiency. The research importance battled with growing unease. Logic suggested heading back towards civilization, abandoning the original route and taking the most direct path to the eastern trailhead. According to my map, that meant following Blackwater Creek downstream through increasingly rugged terrain rather than continuing the planned loop. I packed thoroughly, leaving no trace of my presence, not out of typical wilderness etiquette, but from a growing sense that leaving evidence of my movements might be unwise. The bone arrangements I gathered and buried, though I couldn't articulate why this felt necessary rather than simply leaving them. The descent began straightforwardly enough. The first few miles followed recognizable trail along ridgelines offering expansive views. I maintained a faster pace than normal, checking behind me frequently, though the broad vistas confirmed I was alone in the visible landscape. By midday, I'd descended nearly 2,000 feet in elevation. The trail grew less defined as it entered denser forest approaching the creek drainage. Navigation required closer attention to topographical features rather than established pathway. The creek itself emerged gradually, first as intermittent seeps, then consistent flow, finally a respectable stream cutting through increasingly vertical terrain. I paused at a landmark boulder to check coordinates and eat something. The temperature had dropped noticeably in the drainage, shadows lengthening despite being hours from sunset. As I rechecked my route, I noticed something odd about the map, or rather about the terrain compared to my map. The drainage I followed didn't quite match what was documented. The creek bent eastward sooner than indicated, and rock formations appeared where none were marked. Initially, I attributed this to standard mapping limitations. Even detailed topographical maps simplify complex landscapes. But after another hour of hiking, the discrepancies became impossible to ignore. According to my GPS, I was directly on my planned route. Yet the physical landscape increasingly diverged from documentation. Side drainages appeared where none were mapped. The main creek now cascaded through a series of small waterfalls unmarked on any resource I carried. More concerning were the changes in vegetation. Species appeared that shouldn't exist at this elevation or ecological zone. Plants I recognized from desert regions now growing alongside alpine varieties, creating impossible biome overlaps. I stopped to document this anomaly, photographing several examples. That's when I noticed the first dead animal, a deer lying awkwardly among rocks near the creek. As a biologist, I'm accustomed to encountering mortality in wilderness. What made this concerning was the condition. No apparent cause of death, no predation marks, yet desiccated as though dead for weeks. Yet the eyes appeared unnaturally fresh, and no scavenger had touched it. I continued downstream, now documenting multiple ecological irregularities. The creek itself had developed a slightly iridescent surface quality that couldn't be attributed to natural mineral content. Small fish floated dead in eddies, displaying the same paradoxical preservation state as the deer. Around 3 p.m., I encountered another creek joining from the north, creating a confluence unmarked on any map. This presented a navigation dilemma. Which waterway to follow? Logic suggested the larger flow, but neither matched my documented route anymore. As I evaluated options, I became aware of being watched. Nothing visible, nothing audible, just that primal certainty of observation that humans retain from earlier evolutionary stages. I scanned surrounding forest and rock faces methodically. That's when I saw the first figure, partially obscured by foliage approximately 200 yards upslope. Human-sized but oddly proportioned, observing me with unnatural stillness. When I raised my binoculars, it retreated with startling speed, moving in a quadrupedal gait no human could replicate. I told myself, ranger, hunter, another hiker. But the movement pattern defied human biomechanics. Perhaps illness or injury explaining the unusual locomotion. Perhaps mountain lion, though the upright initial posture contradicted this. I chose the eastern fork arbitrarily, moving with renewed urgency. The canyon narrowed dramatically, cliff walls rising vertically from creek edges, eliminating alternative routes. I was committed to this path now, correct or not. By late afternoon, I faced a serious decision. Daylight would fail within hours, but suitable camping locations seemed non-existent in the narrowing canyon. The creek had swollen significantly, despite no recent rainfall, now occupying most of the canyon floor. Forward progress required repeated stream crossings, soaking boots, and increasing hypothermia risk as temperatures dropped. Then I spotted it. Approximately 400 yards ahead, a large clearing elevated slightly above the creek. Even from distance, I could see rock formations creating natural windbreaks. A viable campsite, perhaps my only option before darkness. As I approached, details emerged that stopped me mid-stride. The clearing showed obvious signs of historical human activity. Not modern campers, but something more permanent and purposeful. Stone configurations forming perfect circles. Remnants of structures unlike any indigenous ruins I'd studied in the Southwest. And most alarmingly, similar bone arrangements to what I'd found at my previous camp, but on much larger scale. Hundreds of individual placements forming complex patterns across the entire clearing. Camping there suddenly seemed unthinkable, but continuing through unknown canyon terrain in fading light carried its own dangers. I stood frozen by indecision as shadows lengthened across the canyon floor, weighing impossible options, while increasingly certain I was being observed from multiple positions along the ridgelines above. The decision was made for me when I glimpsed multiple figures moving with that same unnatural gait along both canyon rims, converging toward my position. I chose immediate movement over paralysis, pushing forward past the clearing, deeper into unknown territory as true darkness began to fall. Darkness in remote canyons is absolute. Without moonlight, the world contracts to whatever your artificial light can illuminate. A bubble of visibility surrounded by perfect black. I moved steadily downstream, headlamp beam reflecting off water and canyon walls, creating disorienting patterns of light and shadow. The technical demands of creek navigation required full attention, testing rocks before committing weight, maintaining balance against current, avoiding drops and undercuts. This hyperfocus became almost meditative, temporarily displacing deeper fears. I'd given up consulting my map or GPS. Whatever terrain I traversed no longer corresponded to documented geography. Navigation simplified to following water downstream, assuming it eventually reached civilization. Basic wilderness principles. Water flows downhill. Downstream leads to larger waterways. Larger waterways lead to human settlement. Around what I estimated to be 8 Warkand p.m., the canyon widened slightly, revealing what appeared to be an abandoned mining operation. Rusted equipment partially reclaimed by vegetation, collapsed timber supports, narrow-gauge rail segments emerging from a dark tunnel entrance. Not unusual in these mountains with their rich extraction history, yet completely undocumented on any map I carried. The site offered shelter possibilities, structures more stable than they initially appeared. After careful inspection, I selected a small equipment shed with intact roof and walls, positioned with good sightlines towards surrounding approaches. Not comfortable, but defensible and hidden. I established minimal camp without fire, consuming cold rations while straining to differentiate natural night sounds from potential pursuit. The temperature dropped rapidly as canyon breeze intensified, carrying unfamiliar scents. Something mineral yet organic that defied categorization. I positioned emergency equipment within reach. Satellite beacon, bear spray, signal flares, knife. Then settled against the back wall where I could observe the single entrance while remaining invisible from outside. Sleep came in disconnected fragments, hypervigilance interrupting normal cycles. During one waking period, I heard distinctive movement outside. Not animal, not wind. Deliberate exploration of the abandoned site. Metal scraped against metal. Something heavy dragged across gravel. Voices communicated in that same approximation of language I'd heard before. Structured sounds conveying meaning, but entirely unfamiliar. I controlled breathing, minimized movement, maintained absolute silence. The explorers approached my shelter, paused outside. Something scraped against exterior walls. Investigating. Testing. I clutched my bear spray, knowing its psychological comfort exceeded practical value against unknown threat. The door latch moved slightly, tested from outside. I prepared for confrontation, rehearsing limited options. The testing stopped. Silence extended uncomfortably. Then came a sound directly above. Movement across the roof, something examining the structure from above. Dust drifted down as boards flexed under weight. Then abrupt departure, multiple entities moving away with that distinctive gait I'd observed earlier. Not running, but covering ground with unnatural efficiency. Their departure sounds faded gradually, suggesting movement up canyon rather than downstream. I remained motionless for over an hour before allowing myself shallow breath. Dawn remained distant. The remainder of night stretched impossibly before me. I focused on controlling physiological response to fear. Regulating breathing, relaxing specific muscle groups, maintaining rational thought processes. Exhaustion eventually overcame vigilance. I dozed fitfully, waking to filtered gray light entering through cracks in the structure. Morning had arrived, bringing temporary reprieve through simple visibility. I examined the site cautiously before emerging. The abandoned mining operation appeared differently in daylight, older than first assessment, weather damage more extensive. And throughout the entire complex, those same symbols I'd seen carved in trees now marked various surfaces, etched in metal, carved in wood, arranged in stone. Most disturbing were fresh tracks surrounding my shelter, numerous distinct patterns converging from multiple directions. Some approximated human footprints but wrong somehow, toe arrangement incorrect, weight distribution impossible. Others defied categorization completely. Most concerning was what I found just outside the door, my own hiking boot print from the previous evening, perfectly surrounded by a larger print that appeared to have been made simultaneously. As though something had stepped precisely where I had, but larger, directly behind me. Something had followed my exact path, matching me step for step without my awareness. I gathered my equipment with mechanical efficiency, consumed minimal calories, and resumed downstream movement with renewed urgency. The canyon continued widening, suggesting approach to valley terrain. Civilization couldn't be far ahead. That's when I discovered the first human remains. The remains lay partially exposed where erosion had cut through an embankment, a distinctive curve of cranium emerging from dark soil. Years of fieldwork had familiarized me with such accidental discoveries in wilderness. Archaeological sites throughout these mountains contain ancestral evidence spanning thousands of years. But as I investigated more closely, disturbing details emerged. The exposure was recent, soil freshly eroded by last night's creek rise, and the remains themselves presented impossible contradictions. The bone coloration and mineralization suggested significant age, centuries at minimum. Yet remnants of modern synthetic fabric adhered to several segments. A weathered leather hiking boot, manufactured within the past decade, still contained foot bones. My scientific training battled with growing horror as I documented the site. The remains appeared to have been processed rather than naturally decomposed. Long bones broken at specific angles for marrow extraction. Cut marks indicating deliberate disarticulation rather than scavenger activity. And portions had been arranged in now familiar symbolic patterns before burial. I should have contacted authorities immediately. In normal circumstances, I would have marked the location, hiked to cellular service, and reported the discovery. But normal parameters had already shattered. I no longer knew my precise location relative to documented geography, and increasingly, I questioned whether reaching out was still possible along my current trajectory. I photographed everything methodically, then continued downstream with renewed urgency. The canyon gradually widened into genuine valley terrain, creek merging with larger waterway. Vegetation transitioned toward riparian species consistent with lower elevation. Normal ecological progression resumed, temporarily reassuring. Around midday, I encountered the first evidence of contemporary human presence. Maintained trail signage indicating junction with established wilderness route. According to the weathered marker, I was approximately 7 miles from the nearest trailhead. Impossible given my starting location and travel distance, yet welcome information regardless of geographical contradiction. The established trail brought considerable relief. Whatever anomalous territory I'd traversed now appeared behind me. I maintained rapid pace while carefully scanning surroundings, vigilance undiminished despite apparent return to documented wilderness. That vigilance revealed subtle but growing abnormalities. Trail maintenance appeared neglected far beyond standard backcountry norms. Blowdowns uncleared for multiple seasons, erosion unchecked, signage deteriorated beyond normal weathering. No boot prints visible despite this being a supposedly popular route. Late afternoon brought my first clear view of distant horizon, revealing smoke columns rising from approximately where the trailhead community should be located. Not small campfire smoke, but massive plumes suggesting structural fires across extensive area. I checked repeatedly for cellular service, finding none despite approaching civilization. My satellite beacon activated normally according to its indicators, but no confirmation signals returned. Both suggested significant infrastructure disruption ahead, rather than typical backcountry communication limitations. As daylight waned, I encountered the crashed vehicle, a Forest Service truck overturned beside the trail, extensively damaged as though rolled repeatedly from the parallel access road visible through trees. Investigation revealed keys still in ignition, driver's side door open. Blood had dried on steering column and dashboard. No occupants present, but drag marks led from the vehicle into surrounding forest. This discovery demanded difficult decision. Darkness approached rapidly. The trailhead reportedly lay several hours ahead, condition unknown. The vehicle offered shelter potential, but also suggested recent violence. Wilderness camping carried its own risks given previous experiences. I chose continued movement, using remaining daylight to cover maximum distance. The trail widened into genuine access road. Gravel initially, then deteriorating asphalt indicating imminent civilization. Structures appeared through trees as sunset color painted western sky. The scattered cabins representing classic rural mountain community. No lights visible despite growing darkness. No chimney smoke despite dropping temperatures. No movement visible anywhere. I approached cautiously, hyper-aware of exposure after days in concealing forest. The first cabin appeared abandoned long-term. Windows broken, vegetation partially reclaiming walls. The second showed contradictory evidence, obvious neglect alongside recent human activity. Door standing open. Fresh boot prints and dust. Food remains from recent meals. The small community presented increasingly disturbing tableau as I investigated systematically. Evidence suggesting abrupt mass departure or removal. Vehicles remained parked outside homes. Personal belongings lay where dropped. One residence contained dining table set for meal never eaten. Most concerning were the now familiar symbols, carved into doors, painted across windows, arranged in stone circles in precisely measured distances around community perimeter. Not ancient markings, but recently created, some still showing wet paint. The valley had darkened completely. I selected the most secure structure, concrete municipal building with functional door locks and minimal windows. The emergency generator functioned after basic maintenance, providing light and rudimentary heat. I established defensive position in interior room, barricaded access points, and inventoried available resources. The building's purpose became clear through investigation. Ranger station and emergency services center for surrounding wilderness. Maps confirming my impossible location. Communication equipment damaged beyond repair. Logbooks containing increasingly frantic entries describing events paralleling my own experiences. The final entry, dated just 3 days prior, remains seared in memory. They've surrounded the entire valley. No communication getting out. Residents gathered here, but supplies limited. They don't come in daylight, but each night they take more. Always the same pattern. Symbols appear, then whispering starts, then they come. God help anyone still in the mountains right now. I spent that night listening to the whispering start as darkness deepened, watching shadows move past windows with familiar yet impossible gait, hearing scratching at doors and walls as symbols gradually appeared across every surface visible from my barricaded position. And I understood, with perfect clarity, that I hadn't escaped anything by reaching this community. I'd simply arrived where others had already experienced what now pursued me. Dawn arrived with merciful light and temporary silence. I emerged cautiously from my barricaded position, systematically checking building security before approaching windows. The community appeared unchanged in morning light, abandoned, silent, surrounded by wilderness that suddenly seemed more adversary than refuge. The communications equipment remained non-functional despite hours of attempted repair. Vehicle keys discovered in the ranger station offered theoretical escape, but investigation revealed sabotage to every government vehicle, fuel lines cut, engines partially disassembled, tires slashed. Someone had methodically eliminated evacuation options. The ranger station records provided context for my experienced anomalies. Incident reports documented progressive events over preceding months. Unusual wildlife behavior initially, then unexplained disappearances of hikers and hunters. Local indigenous consultations regarding historical spiritual boundaries. Geological survey teams reporting equipment failures and mapping inconsistencies in surrounding wilderness, exactly matching my own experiences. Most valuable were the maps, detailed Forest Service documents showing my impossible journey. According to verified geographical data, the canyon system I'd traversed didn't exist as navigated. The mining operation I'd sheltered in had been abandoned in the 1940s, then deliberately collapsed and sealed following unexplained worker disappearances. The symbols I'd encountered were documented in anthropological records as territorial markings used by indigenous cultures to denote forbidden areas, places where boundaries between worlds had thinned. I was gathering supplies for attempted evacuation when I discovered the radio. Not standard Forest Service equipment, but military-grade emergency communication system connected to independent power supply. The operation instructions indicated satellite connectivity functioning on dedicated channels, regardless of local infrastructure. It took nearly an hour to establish transmission protocols. When connection finally confirmed, I provided comprehensive emergency information, location, situation assessment, number of potential survivors, threat evaluation. The response came immediately, voice calm but response concerning. Confirmed visual on your location. Evacuation assets dispatched but earliest arrival, 600 tomorrow. Secure position established in municipal building. Maintain current protocols until extraction. Be advised. Maximum security containment procedures implemented for your location following incident classification. Define current symbol status surrounding your position. I describe the symbols systematically. Locations, patterns, chronology of appearance. The extended silence following my description communicated more than subsequent words. Symbols indicate active hunting phase. Recommend immediate relocation from municipal building. Previous extraction attempts failed when symbols reached current configuration. Alternative shelter recommendations follow. The voice provided coordinates to nearby cave system, apparently offering defensive advantages against what hunted here. According to military assessment, the entities followed consistent pattern: symbolic marking, isolation of prey through infrastructure disruption, individual extraction over multiple nights, eventually taking entire communities. The cave system apparently disrupted their hunting methods through natural geological properties. If I could reach it before sunset, extraction team had higher probability of successful recovery. Estimated survival increased from 15% to 65% with recommended relocation. I gathered essential supplies, documented all findings for potential future evidence, and departed the relative security of the municipal building with profound reluctance. The coordinates indicated cave entrance approximately 4.5 miles northwest, reachable before sunset with immediate departure and direct route. The community appeared different in broad daylight, evidence of struggle more apparent, blood traces visible where darkness had concealed them, drag marks leading from multiple buildings toward surrounding forest. Most disturbing were fresh symbols appearing on previously unmarked surfaces even as I watched, materializing gradually as though being carved by invisible hands. The route northwest led uphill through increasingly thick forest. I maintained rapid pace while documenting key landmarks for potential return navigation. The military coordinates proved precise. Limestone cliff face emerging through vegetation at exactly the described location, narrow entrance partially concealed by natural rockfall. The cave interior extended deep into mountain, evidence of previous human occupation immediately apparent. Modern emergency supplies stacked methodically, communications equipment installed but currently non-functional. Most concerning were defensive preparations, improvised barriers, weapons positioned at strategic points, observation platforms constructed at narrow passages. Someone had prepared for siege here. Recently, I established security according to military protocol instructions, barricading entrance while maintaining observation point. As sunset approached, I witnessed the hunting pattern begin exactly as described. Symbols appearing across visible landscape first, followed by whispered communications from multiple directions, finally shadowed movements becoming gradually more visible as darkness deepened. They no longer concealed their presence or approach. They moved directly toward my position with obvious intent and coordination. Their forms remained difficult to perceive clearly. Something in their movement and structure resisted direct observation, as though existing partially in peripheral vision regardless of direct focus. What could be observed contradicted biological possibility. Limb structures allowing impossible locomotion, physical proportions defying anatomical constraints. They maintained distance initially, establishing perimeter around cave entrance rather than attempting immediate breach. The military instructions had emphasized maintaining complete silence after sunset. Any human vocalization apparently triggered immediate aggression. I complied absolutely, controlling breathing through techniques practiced during previous encounters. Hours passed in silent standoff. Their movements became increasingly animated around midnight. Agitation or excitement communicated through that same approximate language. Something had changed in their behavior pattern. The satellite radio activated unexpectedly. Automatic transmission cutting through silence with mechanical precision. Extraction team compromised. Alternative assets redirected. Estimated arrival revised to approximately 48 hours. Maintain current position. Under no circumstances attempt self-extraction before sunrise. Re-establish communication at 0600 for updated protocols. The transmission brevity suggested emergency communication constraints, likely recorded message dispatched automatically rather than live operator. The content confirmed worst fears. Whatever hunted here had intercepted professional military extraction team. My survival probability had just diminished catastrophically. The entities reacted immediately to the transmission, behavior shifting from containment to direct aggression. They approached cave entrance with coordinated purpose, testing defensive barriers systematically while maintaining constant vocalization. Their language had shifted to include recognizable elements, English words interspersed with their own communication, likely learned from previous victims. They called my name with perfect pronunciation. They described the municipal building where I'd hidden previously. They recited coordinates of my original hiking route. They knew everything about me, my movements, my purpose here. They began dismantling external barriers with methodical efficiency. Not frenzied assault, but deliberate deconstruction. Their physical capabilities became increasingly apparent, strength exceeding human limitations, dexterity allowing manipulation of complex mechanisms, problem-solving intelligence directing coordinated effort. I retreated deeper into cave system, establishing secondary defensive position at narrowest passage. If they breached initial barriers, this choke point offered final advantage, allowing single-direction defense against limited front approach. The night progressed through cycles of assault and temporary withdrawal. Each progressive breach brought them closer to my position. Each withdrawal seemed calculated rather than defeated, assessment rather than retreat. They were learning the cave system's defensive properties, adapting methods accordingly. By pre-dawn hours, they had penetrated approximately 70% of established defenses. My position had compressed to final defensive perimeter. Their vocalizations had evolved to nearly perfect English, now communicating clear intent rather than approximated mimicry. We've taken everyone else. The symbols mark our territory. This has always been ours. You're studying plants that grow from what remains of those who came before. Your government knows. They've always known. They sent people here to feed us, maintain the boundary. You were selected before you ever planned your hike. Dawn approached with agonizing slowness. According to military protocol, they would retreat with first direct sunlight, seemingly unable to maintain physical manifestation in daylight hours. If defensive position held until sunrise, temporary reprieve would allow reassessment and communication with redirected extraction assets. The final barrier failed approximately 20 minutes before sunrise. I maintained defensive position with improvised weapons, no longer attempting concealment or passive resistance. Their forms became partially visible in the cave's darkness, contradicting anatomical possibility while suggesting human origin, as though something had restructured human physiology toward different evolutionary purpose. They moved like humans who had adapted to quadrupedal locomotion over generations. Sunrise arrived with literal salvation, direct light penetrating cave entrance and driving immediate retreat. Their departure carried the same methodical quality as their assault. Not panic, but tactical withdrawal, with clear intent to return. They left additional symbols carved throughout cave interior, territorial markings establishing ownership despite temporary withdrawal. Military communication resumed precisely at 600 as promised. Live operator this time, rather than recorded message. Extraction assets arriving approximately 0900 tomorrow. Containment procedure implemented along valley perimeter. Be advised. Extraction classified as contamination risk protocol. Prepare for full quarantine upon recovery. The implications required no explanation. Whatever had happened in this valley, whatever hunted here, whatever I'd witnessed, extended beyond isolated wilderness anomaly. The military response indicated established protocol for known phenomenon rather than exploratory intervention for new threat. I had 1 day remaining before potential extraction. 1 day to document everything for potential future evidence. One night to survive in deteriorating defensive position against entities who now directly communicated their intent and demonstrated progressive adaptation to defensive measures. As I record these final observations while daylight remains, I retain minimal optimism regarding extraction success. The entities have demonstrated ability to intercept professional military teams. My defensive position has been systematically compromised. The cave system no longer offers significant advantage given their learned countermeasures. If extraction fails, this documentation may provide valuable intelligence for subsequent containment efforts. The entities appear territorial rather than expansionist, maintaining established boundaries marked through symbolic communication. They exhibit progressive learning capability and environmental adaptation. They utilize psychological warfare tactics alongside physical assault. They appear capable of absorbing knowledge from those they take. Night approaches with mathematical certainty. I've established final defensive position at cave entrance rather than interior, optimizing potential extraction access rather than prolonging inevitable compromise. The satellite radio remains functional, monitoring extraction team progress. Their approach vector suggests aerial insertion rather than ground transportation, logical given territorial control demonstrated by entities. The sun touches western horizon now. I observe familiar pattern initiating across visible landscape, symbols manifesting on previously unmarked surfaces, whispered communication beginning from multiple directions simultaneously. Their territorial boundaries expand with each progressive night. The symbols appearing now cover considerably more area than previous manifestations. I will maintain observation and documentation as long as circumstances allow. If extraction succeeds, subsequent debriefing will include all recorded evidence and personal testimony. If extraction fails, this record may provide crucial intelligence for understanding what hunts in these mountains. Final observation as last direct sunlight fades. They've changed their approach pattern tonight. They're not surrounding the cave as previously established. They're forming reception line along projected aerial insertion route. They're anticipating extraction methodology and positioning to intercept. They're learning. The whispers have started. They're saying my name. I pulled my dusty Jeep into Big Bend National Park with what I'd later recognize as laughable confidence. After 15 years as a wilderness photographer and occasional guide, I thought I understood the rhythms of isolated places. My plan seemed straightforward. Capture the dramatic angles of Santa Elena Canyon for my upcoming presentation at the Conservation Society, document some wildlife tracks, and enjoy a night under the stars. The digital thermometer on my dashboard read 102 degrees as I followed the winding park road. Even with the air conditioning straining at maximum, sweat trickled down my neck. Something about the quality of light here always unsettled me. How it bleached colors during the day and transformed everything into menacing silhouettes at dusk. When I finally reached the Santa Elena Canyon parking area, only 2 other vehicles remained: a Park Service truck and a weathered pickup. The visitor center had warned about reduced water levels in the Rio Grande due to the ongoing drought, making river crossings more accessible than usual, to humans and animals alike. As I gathered my camera equipment, a park ranger approached. Her uniform was impeccably pressed despite the heat, but dark circles ringed her eyes. "Planning to hike the canyon trail?" she asked, eyeing my gear. "Just some photography before sunset," I replied. "Anything I should know about?" Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "We've had unusual predator activity lately. Mountain lions mostly. They're coming closer to the trails than we've seen in years." "Drought pushing them toward water sources?" She nodded. "That's our theory. Just keep your eyes open. Don't wander off trail, especially as light fades. And maybe don't stay out too late." Something in her tone made me take the warning more seriously than I might have otherwise. As her truck pulled away, leaving me alone in the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd held something back. The trail to Santa Elena Canyon stretched before me, winding through scrubby vegetation and rocky terrain. Each step kicked up small clouds of dust that hung in the still air. The immense canyon walls loomed ahead, growing more imposing as I approached. A geological masterpiece carved by millennia of flowing water and patient time. I'd been here twice before, but something felt different today. The usual ambient sounds of the desert, distant bird calls, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, seemed muted, as though the landscape itself was holding its breath. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen, increasingly aware of how my footsteps echoed against the stone. The temperature began to drop as the sun lowered toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail. I quickened my pace, wanting to reach the canyon mouth before losing the perfect light for photographs. My backpack felt heavier with each step, the camera equipment inside suddenly an awkward burden. About halfway to the canyon, I stopped to drink from my water bottle. As I tilted my head back, I noticed unusual scratches on a nearby mesquite tree, deep gouges in the bark, far higher than a coyote or javelina could reach. Fresh marks, the exposed wood still pale. Something large had sharpened its claws here recently. I remembered the ranger's warning and scanned the surrounding landscape more carefully. The trail ahead disappeared into a dense thicket of brush before opening up again near the river. Perfect ambush territory for a predator. For a moment, I considered turning back. A photograph wasn't worth the risk, but professional pride pushed me forward. I needed these shots for the presentation, and I'd come too far to return empty-handed. I just needed to remain vigilant. I continued forward, my senses heightened, aware of every shadow, every sound. The canyon entrance was just ahead, but the growing sense of being observed intensified with each step. Not the generalized feeling of being in wild country, but something more specific. The distinct sensation of being targeted. The canyon's entrance framed the remaining daylight dramatically, towering walls of stratified limestone catching the last warm rays of sun. Under different circumstances, I would have been captivated by the play of light and shadow. Instead, I found myself scanning every crevice, every ledge, for movement. I set up my tripod near the edge of the diminished Rio Grande. The water level was indeed lower than I'd ever seen it, a narrow channel rather than the flowing barrier it should have been. The Mexican side of the canyon seemed unnervingly close. Through my telephoto lens, I framed the perfect shot of the canyon's interior when a flicker of movement caught my eye. Across the river, partially obscured by brush, something large shifted position. I adjusted my focus, expecting to see a deer or perhaps a wild pig. What came into view instead froze my blood. A mountain lion, the largest I'd ever encountered, crouched in the shadows. Its tawny coat nearly blended with the surrounding rocks, but its eyes reflected the dying sunlight with an eerie greenish glow. The cat's muscles rippled beneath its hide as it lowered itself even closer to the ground. I remained perfectly still, my finger frozen above the camera's shutter button. Every wilderness training course I'd taken emphasized the same point. Don't run from predators. Running triggers their chase instinct. But knowing this intellectually did nothing to quiet the primal fear surging through my body. The lion's gaze locked onto mine through the camera lens, creating the disturbing illusion that it was only inches away. I could see the individual whiskers on its face, the texture of its nose, the calculating intelligence behind those predatory eyes. It wasn't just looking at me. It was assessing me. With deliberate slowness, I began backing away from the tripod. The cat's ears twitched forward, tracking my movement. The shallow river between us suddenly seemed like an insignificant obstacle. As if reading my thoughts, the mountain lion rose slightly, its shoulder blades creating peaks beneath its skin. It took one silent step toward the water's edge, then paused, head low, tail flicking in that distinctive way that precedes a pounce. My breath caught in my throat. My muscles tensed, preparing to flee, despite knowing it was the worst possible response. In that moment, we were locked in a primitive standoff, predator and prey, separated by nothing more than a few yards of shallow water and millions of years of evolution. A distant sound, perhaps another animal moving through the brush, broke our standoff. The mountain lion's attention shifted momentarily, its head turning slightly toward the noise. That fractional diversion was all I needed. I backed away faster now, abandoning my expensive tripod and camera without a second thought. My foot slipped on loose gravel, sending small stones clattering down the embankment toward the water. The sound drew the cat's focus back to me, its eyes narrowing. In one fluid motion, it dropped into a crouch again, muscles bunching beneath its hide. I knew what was coming next. Without conscious thought, I turned and ran. Every footfall on the rocky trail thundered in my ears. Each breath burned in my lungs. I expected at any moment to feel claws tearing into my back, to be driven face first into the dirt by several 100 pounds of apex predator. But the attack never came. After 50 yards of blind panic, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The mountain lion remained on the far bank, watching me flee with what appeared to be cold curiosity rather than predatory intent. Perhaps the river, shallow as it was, still presented enough of an obstacle. Perhaps I wasn't worth the effort. I didn't stop running until I reached a bend in the trail that finally broke our line of sight. Doubling over, hands on knees, I gulped air into burning lungs. Sweat drenched my shirt despite the cooling evening air. My camera equipment, several $1,000s worth, stood abandoned near the river's edge. For 15 minutes, I remained frozen in indecision. The rational part of my brain argued that I should retrieve the equipment. Mountain lions rarely attack adult humans, and this one had shown no aggressive behavior beyond its intimidating stare. The primitive part of my brain, however, screamed that nothing was worth risking a confrontation with that efficient killing machine. In the end, self-preservation won. As twilight deepened into dusk, I made the shameful choice to continue back to the parking lot without my gear. I could report the encounter to park rangers, perhaps return with them in the morning. Photographs, no matter how important, weren't worth my life. The hike back stretched interminably. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow that shifted in the growing darkness, became a potential threat. By the time I reached my Jeep, my shirt was soaked through with fear sweat, and my hands trembled so badly I struggled to unlock the door. The ranger station was closed by the time I reached it. A handwritten sign directed emergency calls to a number I immediately dialed, but the conversation proved less than reassuring. "We've had 3 mountain lion sightings this week," the ranger confirmed after I described my encounter. "Unusual behavior, definitely concerning. But we're short-staffed tonight. I can't send anyone to retrieve your equipment until morning." "What about the cat?" I asked. It seemed, I don't know, unusually bold. A pause. "We're monitoring the situation. Just stick to designated camping areas tonight and keep your food secured. We'll meet you at the trailhead at 7 tomorrow." The campsite the ranger directed me to was little more than a cleared area with a fire ring and pit toilet. One other vehicle was parked there, a compact car with out-of-state plates. Its occupants had already retired to their tent for the night, the thin fabric glowing from a lantern inside. I parked my Jeep with the headlights illuminating as much of the surrounding area as possible before shutting off the engine. The abrupt darkness that followed seemed to press against the windows like a physical presence. Even with the doors locked and windows up, I felt dangerously exposed. The persistent cough I'd been fighting for days flared up, leaving me gasping. I fumbled through my supplies until I found the bottle of NyQuil I'd packed as a precaution. The medicine's potent drowsiness effect might be the only thing capable of overriding my hypervigilant state. I measured out a dose, swallowed the syrupy liquid, and arranged my sleeping bag in the back of the Jeep. Every few minutes, I swept my flashlight across the campsite perimeter, half expecting to catch reflective eyes staring back at me. The neighboring campers extinguished their lantern, plunging the site into near-total darkness. The quarter moon provided just enough illumination to transform ordinary objects, a twisted juniper tree, a stack of rocks, a signpost, into crouching figures poised to attack. The NyQuil began working within 20 minutes, dragging me toward unconsciousness despite my resistance. My thoughts grew disconnected, fragmentary. The memory of the mountain lion's stare merged with half-formed dreams, creating a kaleidoscope of menace. In this twilight state between wakefulness and sleep, I became convinced I could hear scratching against the Jeep's exterior. Soft at first, then more insistent, claws testing the metal shell that protected me. I tried to sit up to grab my flashlight, but my limbs felt impossibly heavy. The scratching moved around the vehicle, methodical and patient. I managed to turn my head toward the window, and for one heart-stopping moment, I was certain I saw the mountain lion's face pressed against the glass, its whiskers splayed, breath fogging the surface, eyes luminous with hunger. I tried to scream but produced only a strangled whimper. The medication had rendered me paralyzed, trapped in a body that wouldn't respond while my mind remained terrifyingly alert. The lion's face disappeared, but the scratching continued, now underneath the vehicle. Metal groaned as something heavy pressed against the chassis. I imagined claws working their way through the floorboards, seeking soft flesh. Time distorted. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The sounds continued, scratching, breathing, occasional low growls that vibrated through the metal. I floated in pharmaceutical half-consciousness, unable to distinguish reality from nightmare. At some point, I must have fallen fully asleep, because the next sensation I registered was being jolted awake by a piercing scream that cut through the night. My eyes flew open, heart hammering against my ribs. The scream came again, a high, wavering sound that no human throat could produce. A mountain lion's call. Close, very close. I lurched upright, the medication's effect leaving me disoriented and nauseous. My watch read 3:17 a.m. The interior of the Jeep was stifling, my sleeping bag drenched with sweat. The cat screamed again, the sound bouncing off canyon walls, making it impossible to determine direction or distance. I fumbled for my flashlight and swept the beam across the windows. Nothing visible, but that meant little. Mountain lions are masters of concealment. A sudden, irrational panic seized me. What if the doors had somehow come unlocked? What if I'd left a window cracked open? I scrambled to check each door, each window, breathing only when I confirmed the vehicle remained secured. The neighboring tent showed no signs of disturbance. Either its occupants were remarkably heavy sleepers, or they too were lying awake, motionless with fear. Another scream, closer this time. I couldn't remain passive any longer. I crawled into the driver's seat and started the engine, flooding the area with headlights. The sudden illumination revealed nothing but empty ground and twisted vegetation. I left the engine running, taking comfort in its mechanical rumble. For the next 3 hours, I maintained a vigil, alternating between scanning the surroundings and checking the time. Each minute crawled by with excruciating slowness. Twice more I heard the mountain lion's call, each time from a different direction, as though it were circling the campsite. Sometime after 5 a.m., exhaustion overcame vigilance. I must have dozed off because I awakened with a start to find the engine had died. The silence was absolute, the darkness nearly complete. I jabbed the key in the ignition, but the engine only clicked weakly. The battery had drained. Panic clawed at my throat. Without the protective barrier of noise and light, I felt naked, exposed. The first hints of dawn were still an hour away. I pressed my back against the driver's door, eyes straining to penetrate the darkness beyond the windows. That's when I saw it, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness near the pit toilet. Low to the ground, moving with that distinctive feline grace. The mountain lion had been there all along, watching, waiting. I remained frozen as it padded silently across the campsite, passing within yards of my disabled vehicle. It paused near the neighboring tent, head lowering to sniff at the ground where the campers had prepared their evening meal. My breath fogged the window as I watched, transfixed by terror and awe. The cat continued its inspection of the site, marking territory against a boulder, then vanishing into the pre-dawn darkness as silently as it had appeared. The eastern sky lightened incrementally, stars fading as night reluctantly released its grip. I hadn't moved from my vigilant position, muscles cramped, eyes burning from strain and lack of sleep. As visibility improved, I scanned the campsite for signs of the mountain lion. Nothing obvious remained of its visit. No paw prints I could discern, no clear evidence I could point to. Had I imagined it? Had the NyQuil induced a waking hallucination? The neighboring tent stirred with morning activity. A man emerged, stretching, apparently unaware of the night's drama. I watched him move about his camp with envious normalcy, setting water to boil on a small stove. When he noticed me sitting motionless in my Jeep, he raised a hand in greeting. I managed a weak wave in return. How could I explain what had happened? That I'd spent the night besieged by a predator he'd somehow slept through. It took 3 attempts before the Jeep's engine finally turned over. The neighboring camper approached, concern evident on his face. "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I attempted a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Battery issues. And didn't sleep well." He nodded sympathetically. "The coyotes were really going at it last night. Kept waking me up." Coyotes. Not mountain lions. Had I misidentified the sounds? No, I knew the difference between a coyote's yip and a mountain lion's scream. But I lacked the energy to argue the point. "I'm meeting the rangers at 7, I said instead. "Left some equipment on the trail yesterday." "Happens to the best of us," he said cheerfully. "Good luck." I drove toward the ranger station, windows up despite the morning heat, constantly checking the rearview mirror. The landscape looked innocuous in daylight, beautiful even. Sunlight gilded the canyon walls. Early birds darted between cacti and wildflowers dotted the roadside. The ranger who'd taken my call greeted me with professional concern. "Sorry about your equipment. We'll head out there now. Should be safe enough in daylight." "The mountain lion," I began, then hesitated. "It was at the campsite last night. I saw it." She frowned. "You're sure? We haven't had reports of one coming that close to campers." "Positive. It circled my vehicle for hours. Made those screaming calls." Her expression remained skeptical. "Well, we'll keep an eye out. Mountain lions generally avoid humans unless they're sick or desperate." We recovered my camera equipment without incident. The morning sun had transformed the canyon into a photographer's dream. Exactly the conditions I'd hoped for yesterday. But I couldn't bring myself to linger, to set up my tripod again. Every shadow, every rustle in the underbrush sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. As we headed back to the trailhead, the ranger pointed out fresh tracks near the water's edge, unmistakably feline, impressively large. "You weren't imagining things," she admitted. "That's a big tom, probably the same one we've been tracking. Drought's got them all behaving strangely." I nodded, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and renewed fear. "Will you trap it? Relocate it?" "Not unless it becomes aggressive toward humans. This is its territory. We're the visitors here." I left Big Bend that afternoon, hours earlier than planned. The remaining photographs I needed would have to come from stock images or previous trips. No presentation was worth another night in that primal landscape where the comfortable illusion of human dominance evaporated like morning dew. As I crossed the park boundary, I found myself offering a silent prayer of gratitude to God for my survival. The mountain lion's stare had stripped away something I hadn't realized I carried, a false sense of security, of separation from the natural world with all its beauty and brutality. I still give presentations about wildlife conservation. I still advocate for protecting apex predators and their habitats. But I do so with newfound humility and respect born of terror. Because once you've been seen, truly seen, by something that registers you not as a fellow being, but as potential sustenance, you never quite regain your place at the top of the perceived order. Sometimes in dreams, I still see those eyes watching me through the darkness. Patient, calculating, waiting for a moment of vulnerability. And I wake knowing that out there, in places where wilderness still rules, I am not the hunter. I am the hunted.